There are maps you were allowed to see, and maps that were never meant to reach your hands. Maps carved into stone vaults, sealed in monasteries, hidden beneath royal libraries, and protected by men whose job was not to discover the world, but to hide it. And if you think maps simply show land and sea, let me tell you something. Maps are weapons, the oldest and most subtle instruments of power in human history. Before we begin, where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Tell me in the comments below. And if you haven't already, like, share, and subscribe. Because what you are about to hear is the kind of history that was not written for the average person. The kind of history whispered, erased, rewritten, and hidden behind the illusion that everything important has already been discovered. Today, we step into the shadows of the men who kept the world blind. The ones who decided what you are allowed to believe the world looks like. The idea that the Earth, we learn in school, the neat continents divided into political colors, represents reality is comforting. It makes the world feel complete, final, finished, as if everything is known. But civilizations are not built on truth. They are built on control. And nothing allows control more effectively than telling populations where they live, how big their world is, and what lies beyond. The first rulers realized this long before modern nations existed. If people believe there is nothing beyond their borders, they will not explore. If people believe the world is smaller, they will not question what is hidden. And if explorers find lands rich with resources, knowledge, or strategic power, but the maps are kept secret, then only the rulers benefit. Let's go back to ancient Egypt. While most people think of hieroglyphics carved into walls depicting rituals and kings, there were also map rooms, hidden chambers where priests recorded river routes, desert paths, star navigation lanes, and distant territories never mentioned to the public. Common Egyptians believed their kingdom was the center of the world. Only the elite priesthood knew of lands further south. Beyond Nubia, and beyond that, a lush region of forests, lakes, and mountains. But that knowledge was dangerous. If the public learned that greater resources existed outside the king's domain, the illusion of divine rule would collapse. So the information was sealed inside temples, guarded only by those who served the throne, not truth. Later, in Greece, we see the same pattern. Scholars like Eratosthenes measured the shape and circumference of Earth with surprising accuracy, knowledge that should have changed the world. But instead of becoming common education, the most accurate calculations were locked in royal archives. Because whoever controls the size of the world controls the ambition of nations. Centuries later, when Rome dominated the Mediterranean, every military conquest depended on advanced mapping. The Roman Empire had a secret document, known today only through fragments, called the Forma Urbis, a marble map that laid out the empire with precision. But the empire did not share this with the public, merchants, or scholars. They gave common people a simplified version, a world that looked smaller, tamer, less full of unknowns, because Rome understood something essential. Fear of the unknown is a ruler's greatest ally. If the world beyond your borders is described as chaos, monsters, darkness, people will stay obedient. Then we move into the medieval era, where the game becomes even clearer. European maps were drawn not to reflect reality, but to reflect the authority of the church. Jerusalem was placed at the center. Lands were exaggerated or erased to support doctrine. And while these public maps looked symbolic, spiritual, and distorted, secret nautical maps used by knights, traders, and private agents showed much more coastlines, islands, currents. These were never released because geography was a strategic asset. Knowledge of sea routes meant control of commerce, war, and contact with foreign civilizations. But the real shift, the real inflection point, comes with the age of exploration. When Spain, Portugal, England, and others raced across oceans, they did not just collect gold and spices. They collected geographic intelligence. The moment Columbus returned from the Caribbean, the Spanish crown issued orders. Maps are now state secrets. Revealing coastlines, harbors, and inland territories became treason. Anyone caught selling or copying maps could be executed. This is the moment the map keepers become formalized, men whose profession was to hide the true shape of the world. Explorers were often not allowed to keep copies of the routes they discovered. Detailed maps were locked inside vaults in Seville, Lisbon, and the Vatican. Pirates, who understood this, sometimes attacked ships not for gold, but for navigation charts. Because in the real power structure of the world, Gold is temporary. But knowledge of land, knowledge of sea, knowledge of where resources are buried. That is civilization-level power. And so a global geography existed that the public never saw. Textbooks showed the world as one thing, while intelligence bureaus and empires worked from another version entirely. This practice never ended. Modern governments continue this. Satellite mapping is filtered. Borders are drawn to reflect political narratives, not objective geography. There are territories blacked out on public datasets. There are islands on naval maps that appear nowhere else. There are regions labeled as uninhabited that are very quietly occupied and monitored. And behind this, there is always the same kind of man, the map keeper. The one who doesn't explore, but receives the reports from those who did, and decides what the world is allowed to look like. These men are rarely remembered. They leave no statues, no epics, no monuments, yet they have shaped your understanding of Earth more than kings, more than conquerors, more than scientists, because they determine the boundaries of imagination. If a population believes the world is known, they stop searching. If they believe history is complete, they stop questioning. If they believe there is nothing left to uncover, they become easy to manage. And so the greatest treasure map in history is not the one that shows where wealth is. It is the one that shows what you are not allowed to see. There are places that existed but were later erased, places that appear in ancient records, navigation logs, and oral histories, yet vanished from modern atlases as if they were ghosts of geography. And the mapkeepers didn't just hide land, they edited the world. To understand how this works, we must go to Alexandria, not the romanticized version, but the real one, where the great library was not just a collection of scrolls, but a civilization's server, a data center, before the concept existed. Every ship that entered the port was forced to hand over its maps, trade logs, and navigational sketches. Scholars copied everything. Then, and this is the part that matters, the original maps were not always returned. Alexandria did not grow by gathering knowledge, it grew by absorbing and controlling it. Trade routes discovered by Phoenicians and Nubians, oceanic patterns learned by Arabian navigators, and river maps recorded by African travelers all ended up in the archive, and most were hidden. Empires need the illusion that their discoveries were first. The ancient world was far more connected than your textbooks admit. But history is written by the winners, and winners like to appear miraculous. But Alexandria was not the only hub. We must also look to the Vatican, inside its private library, far underground, guarded by protocol and silence, lie charts that never entered public education. Medieval missionaries who traveled into Asia, Africa, and the Americas brought back sophisticated geographic data, mountain passes, river basins, trade routes, population centers. This data did not circulate, it was classified. The Vatican did not just hold spiritual power, it controlled global geographic intelligence long before the term existed. When a map shows you where people are, it also shows you where they can be influenced. Now consider something else. Before modern maps, many civilizations described lands beyond known coasts, lush territories overflowing with resources. But in the centuries that followed European expansion, these same lands began to disappear from maps entirely. Why? Because once a land is claimed, colonized, or economically extracted, the ruling powers no longer want others to know how much they truly took. They reduce resource zones into blank spaces, deserts, or uninhabited regions, even when those places were full of life. A perfect example lies in ancient West Africa. Maps from Mali, Songhai, and Carthage recorded extensive cities, advanced metallurgy, navigation across the Sahara, and even transatlantic contact. But once Europe entered West Africa in search of gold, those maps were wiped, rewritten, declared myth. The narrative changed from powerful, complex civilizations to primitive tribal lands. Why? Because maps control perception, and perception controls justification. If the world believes a land has no culture, no writing, no cities, then taking it looks like civilizing, not stealing. The mapkeepers were not passive archivists. They were architects of global narrative. They designed the borders of imagination. Let us go further east. In China, during the Ming Dynasty, Admiral Zhang He led massive voyages across the Indian Ocean in giant treasure ships, far larger than anything used later by Europe. They documented coastlines, ecological zones, and harbors with astonishing precision. Yet, when policymakers shifted and priorities changed, the maps were ordered burned. China turned inward. The world map was deliberately shrunken, and history pretended expansion beyond Asia never occurred. A civilization that once mapped the world chose to forget it, to preserve internal order, stability, and central authority. Knowledge of the world was seen as destabilizing, because once people know how big the world is, they begin asking why they are not part of it. And then we reach the most dangerous part of the story, the maps that include places we are told do not exist. Ancient Greek scholars wrote of Terra Australis Incognita, a southern continent balanced to offset the landmasses of the north. Early Islamic geographers described lands far across oceans not yet discovered. Polynesian navigation chants map islands thousands of miles apart, with poetic coordinate systems that modern science only recently learned to decode. And perhaps most unsettling of all, the Peary race map, created in 1513, shows the coastlines of South America and Antarctica with non-ice covered detail, something modern science did not confirm until the 20th century. This suggests two possibilities. Either ancient civilizations traveled farther than we acknowledge, or they received geographic information from civilizations we no longer remember. The map keepers, throughout history, always chose the explanation that preserves hierarchy. These maps are mistakes. But mistakes do not replicate across cultures separated by oceans and centuries. Knowledge leaves fingerprints. So how do you hide the world? You redraw it. That's what colonial cartography did. That's what modern borders do. Maps today are political sculptures, not objective measurements. Nations inflate their size to project power. Disputed zones are drawn in whichever shape benefits textbooks. Satellite imagery is blurred in areas where governments conduct operations they deny having, and most people believe the map they are shown because they never see the version reserved for strategic planning. This is why the map keepers always survived, even when empires fell. They simply migrated into new institutions. Royal cartographers became naval surveyors, who became intelligence officers, who became satellite data analysts. The job never changed. Only the tools did. But here is the final truth, the one that slips between the cracks of history. If maps shape how we see the world, then whoever controls maps controls not just geography, but destiny. A child who believes the world is explored will never try to discover anything. A generation convinced all civilizations were isolated will never understand how ideas spread. A society told the world is divided by borders will never see its common origins. And this is why the map keepers mattered. They were not merely hiding land, they were defining reality. The world you live in is not the world that exists. It is the world you were allowed to see. But the borders of knowledge are cracking. Digital leaks, declassified archives, archaeological findings, and indigenous oral histories are revealing pieces of a world map, more ancient, more interconnected, and more complex than the one drawn in your school atlas. It is now possible to reconstruct what the map keepers tried to erase. Not perfectly, but enough to know they hid something enormous. So the question becomes, what did they fear? What truth was so powerful that entire empires burned libraries, executed navigators, censored scholars, and sealed maps in vaults? Not treasure, not land, not gold, but something far greater. The knowledge that the world was never separate. It was always one. They didn't just hide coastlines, they hid their connection. They didn't just hide continents, they hid contact. They didn't just hide geography, they hid the story of humanity. And now it is returning. If you are ready for the next episode, where we uncover the suppressed expeditions, forbidden cartographers, and maps that contradict modern history, then listen carefully. Before you scroll, like the video, share this story, comment what you learned, and if you haven't yet, subscribe, because we have more to uncover, and we are just getting started.